Be informed, be inspired. Join us for the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. Tune in and listen for both modern and ancient wisdom on all things maternity, parenting and sacred women's business. Right here on the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show.
Welcome to Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. Our show is coming to you from the studios of BFM in Byron Bay and is broadcasting across Australia on the Community Radio Network. You're here with me, Lara Martin. "Oh, grandmother," she said, "what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my child," was the reply. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have," she said. "All the better to see you with, my dear." "But grandmother, what large hands you have, all the better to hug you with." "Oh, but grandmother, what terrible big mouth you have, all the better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this, than with one bound he was out of the bed and swallowed up Red Riding Hood. This episode of Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond, we delve into the world of children's literature, and more specifically, violence and scary themes in children's stories. Is there any value to violence in stories for children? Is Scarefest, for the sake of entertainment, potentially harming children? This episode I interview three guests: psychologist and author Robin Grille, children's storyteller, singer-songwriter Annie Bryant, and Luminous youth founder Erica Nettle Chick. We're going to go right into hearing from our first guest, which is Robin Grille, on his understanding of violence in children's stories. Robin is a psychologist, speaker and author of Parenting for a Peaceful World and Heart-to-Heart Parenting.
You're going to be very, very hard-pressed to find any story, whether it's a story for children or not, that doesn't contain some, intense conflict and potentially some violence as well. It's intrinsic to story. If you want to find out where the line is between, really gratuitous violence in the stories that we choose for our children and the violence that is pretty inevitable in a story, you're going to find that where to draw that line becomes a very personal thing. And if you have 10 experts stating their opinion on where to draw that line, 10 experts in a room will give you 11 different opinions. It becomes, we cannot escape from the fact that becomes a personal choice. And, in despair, we look for some kind of a guide of, like an objective index. I could tell you a lot of the books that I found for, young adult novels today, the violence in it is so explicit and graphic. It's horrific. I'm appalled at it, actually. I think it's bad writing to give so much detail about violence, apart from the fact that it does become, overloading to the body, and just, it's a worry for me of how shocking the violence is that is being given to our kids through literature now. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, stories will usually contain some conflict that's necessary to the story, and violence. And there is a purpose to that. There is a purpose to that. There's a way in which, as we travel through a story in our imagination, it gives us this kind of like a practice. It's sort of like a simulator for real life in a way for our nervous system. We get a kind of a practice at how are we going to meet the challenges of life, because life is conflict every day. Conflict with this, conflict with that. So stories, that's one aspect that you can say that is the value of story. It prepares our minds for conflict. There's, lots of other things to say about story. Beautiful teachings and just the pleasure of it, and just the working of the imagination, because our imagination is so very, very important to everything we do in our lives. But yeah, I think that is why you will find it difficult not to find, to find a story that doesn't contain violence, yeah, a little bit of it, and you probably find that if it doesn't, often kids will be bored with that story. We look for the scary in story. We want to be given like a homeopathic level of fear and tension in the story that we read. Of course, there's a level of overwhelm where that's too much and we don't like it anymore. But look at that as a phenomenon that kids, including us when we were kids, we're drawn to that. And why is it that we're attracted to a kind of a safe level of fear? One way to look at that is, there's so many things you can say about that. For one, that's part of how we start to learn how to hold fear, how to conquer fear, how to live with fear because it's a companion in our lives. It starts to activate all our different responses to fear. And we don't just want the fear for its own sake. We also want some kind of a resolution. We want to see, people in the story, elements, creatures, characters in the story that demonstrate some kind of role modeling for how they make it through by being brave or by asking for help or by, doing something that enables them to conquer the frightening moment in the story. Someone once said to me that laughter is what happens when you meet something quite frightening within a safe context. It makes you laugh. There's an intrinsic pleasure in that, a joy. Why do you think that everyone wants to go up into a roller coaster? Or, what's one of the first things that parents do with a little baby? When baby has a strong enough, say enough kind of muscle tone in their neck so their heads don't wobble about, look at how we start just gently throwing our baby up a little bit and catching them. You do that too much, of course, you cause a terrible injury. But you know what I'm talking about. And there's a delight. And babies feel a little bit of that micro moment of fear. And then they realize, oh no, I'm safely held and nothing's going to happen. And the laughter, like rivers of laughter. And so we have to come to terms with the fact that as humans, we're attracted to being scared in a context of conquering that and finding safety at the other end. Now, when you do that in an overwhelming way too much, when we give kids monsters without holding them, or monstrous stories that go into horrible detail, right there, I think we have to pull the pin on that and say, no, that's a question of too much. The purpose of it isn't about leaving kids with nightmares. The purpose is to leave them with a sense of empowerment and exhilaration. So, right, there's the helpful monster is quite distinct from the traumatizing monster.
Violence is an important part, if unpleasant aspect of the world that has endured for centuries and continues today. When used in an effective and careful manner, violence can serve important purpose in literature. It does not seem to correlate with violent tendencies in children. It sparks interest in reading and it can enhance a child's understanding of ways to cope with conflict or violence arise in their own lives. While violence in literature can have many benefits for young readers, certain criteria must be taken into account before one can deem a book worthwhile for the classroom or for reading with you at home. Those choosing literature with violent aspects should certainly assess the material to check that the violence portrayed serves a purpose, such as showing the consequences of violence or alternatives to violent actions. Unfortunately, violence is not likely a part of human nature that can be entirely eradicated, although if children are familiar with relevant and useful literature that teaches them about violence, they have a better chance of facing a world of violence and conflict responsibly. And that was sourced from Aneta Reading Journal article titled, "Does Violence Have a Place in Children's Literature?" So how do children's storytellers and authors get the balance between just gruesome graphic gore and what is intrinsic to a story? Who better to ask than a children's storyteller and writer? My guest Annie Bryant shares with us her perspective on the role of story violence in her writing and also the literature she feeds her children.
So what I do is I create collections of audio stories as well as songs, and they're very much, all of my work is very much inspired by connecting children and the parents who are listening in to the natural rhythms of life. So to the natural world, to the seasons, to all those very innate rhythms that are always going on around us. And it is about connecting us with nature, but it's also about connecting us with ourselves. What I do is so much about looking at both the sunshine, the beautiful sunny moments of life, of nature, as well as looking about the dark times, the stormy times. So at the moment we're living on a farm on the far south coast of New South Wales, and we're very much experiencing on a very feeling, touching, deep level life and death on the farm. And it's so important that we as parents are nourishing our children with both the life and the death. That's what I'm really coming to through our experience here on the farm. But also, I've always felt that in all of my writing for children. So much of what we feed children today, importantly, and should be about, the positive, the happy experiences, the good things, because that's what we're always leading our children towards, those healthful, beautiful experiences, always beautiful experiences. And to get to those experiences, we will face suffering in ourselves. Life isn't always about the beautiful baby goat that was born on our farm 4 days ago. Such a beautiful experience to actually watch the goat come out of her mother. We were hidden in the grass watching. And that was so deeply nourishing for all of us. And a few days later, that baby goat didn't make it. And we found it on the grass in the morning in the cold. And there was something wrong with it. And, we don't know really why, but its brother made it and it didn't. And then, to behold the deep tears that I cried and my sons cried and their father cried because, we'd nursed this little one for 3 days. And, he didn't make it. And that's life, and we still had his brother to behold and wonder, and so joyous to be around. Life is filled with death and life and death and life, and it's a constant rhythm, a constant cycle that we see every sunrise to sunset, every winter to spring, every, metamorphosis, anything, all those things that are happening in nature all around. And I think everything we need to be able to behold those experiences in a very deep and holistic way, everything we need, it's all there in nature if we stop and look and listen and feel and really feel them. I think that's what really teaches us and our children resilience in life. So I guess what informs so much of what I feed my children, and that's how I look at literature, what I share with them and now what they read for themselves. And we still have read aloud stories too, which I'll talk about in a minute. So much of what informs that for me, it comes from that very Steiner education perspective. So it's fairy tales. So you're taking a very deep and profound wisdom that are held within these old tales. Now, these are tales that have grown from nature, of course, and they've also grown from our early days of civilization. So they're very much informed from where our culture have come from. Now, I'm also very, very aware that these tales are fairy tales. So, and I believe children feel them in that way. They're not from this time or this place. They are from another place. They're from another world in a way. And so the violent or challenging moments in them they're speaking to something else in the child, something very deep.